I don't think about Christopher Columbus that often. He's not the most current topic, but when I do think about him, I'm rather ambivalent about it. I don't know whether to admire him or be disgusted by him. Was he a hero or was he a thug? I don't know what to do with this guy. Up until this point, I'd never investigated the man, but recently I made it a goal to do a little digging and learn something about the character and the intentions of Christopher Columbus. The first thing I did to pursue this topic was read A People's History of the United States. It was written by Howard Zinn. It was published in 1980. Chapter 1 of this book evaluates Christopher Columbus, and it is a very compelling read. The writing is excellent. It's very persuasive. It's very detailed. And I felt awful reading this book. Columbus was a psychopath. He was a cruel bastard, callous, belligerent. I'm sitting there reading this book thinking, this guy's not your friend. I don't like him. I don't like him. Howard Zinn refers to the writings of a 16th century Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas. And according to him, Christopher Columbus was obsessed with gold, glory, and getting slaves. And he ordered brutal violence against the natives who had no chance. The Spaniards had swords, armor, crossbows, attack dogs, and the indigenous, who by Columbus's own account were very kind and generous, they had no weaponry to speak of. So they got massacred over and over, and they were enslaved by Columbus. And I'm sitting there thinking, there's a holiday for this guy. We have cities and countries and universities named after him. There are monuments to him all over the world. Why? Guy's a terrible person. But something was suspect. As the cortisol in my brain began to lower and I was less worked up over it, I started to wonder if the whole story wasn't being told here. I noticed that the entire section devoted to Columbus was exactly 9 pages long. 9 pages. That's not even 10 pages. And there's approximately 12 quotes from primary sources, which seems light to me. I wouldn't call it a deep dive. I also found it confusing because the sequence of events is all jumbled. Although the writing is very eloquent, there's no clear timeline as to when or where Columbus is during his time in the Caribbean. So as a story, I couldn't really grasp it.
I'm not sure that I agree with you 100% on your police work there, Lo.
Yeah?
Yeah?
Next, I read Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen. It was published in 1995, and like A People's History, it's known for its raw take on U.S. history. The premise is that we've all been raised on an ideologically motivated version of history, the sugar-coated Disney version of history, and authors like Zinn and Lowen are the response to that. They offer a more honest, unedited telling of the historical events that we think we know. Lowen's book is also a smart read, but he goes beyond Howard Zinn and covers Columbus in 40 pages, which is nice because typically history books don't give us anywhere near that. This is the only mention Columbus gets in a 10th grade world history book. 1 paragraph. But Lies My Teacher Told Me has the same problem as Howard Zinn. There's very few excerpts from primary sources, and it's not organized so that the reader can trace Columbus's journey to and around the Caribbean. There's not enough information here. It just reads like a tangle of horrific scenes with scraps of these despicable quotes attributed to Christopher Columbus.
Then what's it all about? Why don't you illuminate me?
So these books, in my estimation, are more belief system than factual. And they're obviously ideologically motivated. It's just coming from the opposite direction. Now, the authors do expose some lies, but they also create some lies of their own, lies by omission. I'll say these books are worth reading, just don't stop there. Please. I'm so thirsty. The third book I read was Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. It was published in 2011. It was written by Carol Delaney. She's a professor with a PhD in cultural anthropology, and she spent 5 years researching Christopher Columbus. Now, this book was a very different experience. It's not an article. It's not a chapter. It's not a section on Christopher Columbus. It's an entire book about the man. And she doesn't just begin at the beginning. She begins way before the beginning, long before Christopher Columbus was even conceived. The Black Death, the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople, and she carries us up through the Middle Ages and through the decade or so that Christopher Columbus encountered the Americas. And for readers who like to get down into the weeds, this book is packed with excerpts. Excerpts from Christopher Columbus's diary, his son Ferdinand Columbus's diary, the diary of Bartolomé de las Casas. There are quotes from letters, memos, ship logs, even correspondences with Queen Isabella, who sponsored the whole expedition to begin with. There are dimensions to Christopher Columbus that we never get when reading all the scathing articles out there about him. One complexity was his ability to fit in different environments. For one, he was at ease among Spanish royalty and at the courts, And at the same time, he was perfectly comfortable at the monastery with the monks, studying and praying. He was a deeply spiritual man, practically a Franciscan monk himself. Everybody knows Christopher Columbus was an adept sea captain. He could pilot a ship, manage a crew of sailors, draft a map from scratch, but the technical skill of navigation says nothing about his morality or his personality, his nature, his demeanor, and most articles out there would have you believe that he was just a war criminal who happened to know how to drive a sailboat. But the truth is, when Columbus arrived in the Americas, he easily befriended the natives. He cared for them. He made long-lasting, meaningful friendships with them, with one Indian chief in particular. And they liked him. They really liked him. They wanted to get on his ship and travel back to Spain. They thought of him as the chief of Europe, and they wanted to go and visit his village. So much so that the capacity of the ship couldn't handle all the Indians that wanted to come with. And by natives, I'm referring to the Arawak and the Taino Indians of the Bahamas and Hispaniola, to whom there was plenty of violence and atrocities done to them, including being enslaved. To the extent that the label genocide is extremely appropriate, it was horrific stuff. But Columbus didn't do it. He advocated for them. He tried to protect them. I'm pretty sure it's common knowledge, but slavery was a custom of the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Islamic world, but it was also practiced by the indigenous themselves. People were captured and enslaved long before Columbus arrived, and the truth is, Columbus never owned a slave. I know there's a ton of articles out there alleging that he did, but it's just rumors and internet BS.
Your Eminence! Rubbish! Rubbish! Your Eminence! Your Eminence! Your Eminence. In the territories covered by Spain, there is no slavery. That institution, however, is permitted in the territories of our excellent neighbors, the Portuguese, and is to my mind much misunderstood. But here in Spanish territory, we conduct our plantation in strict accordance with the laws of Spain and the precepts of the Church. That is a lie. That is a lie. I cannot and will not accept a challenge from a monk. His cloth protects him.
My cloth protects you,
in the
Senor
name of
Cabeza.
the king, whose dignity I represent, I demand an apology. I want an apology now. Damn you, I won't stand for this.
Here's the situation as I see it. Columbus never personally owned a slave, but he did manage the export of 26 human beings from Hispaniola back to Spain. But those particular captives were warlike cannibals who practiced slavery themselves, behaviors that in any civilized country today would land a person in prison. So the slave trade that involved Columbus directly, it wasn't good. But it wasn't that bad either, at least by 16th century standards. Now, if Columbus had rounded up the gentle-natured Taino and Arawak Indians, or authorized it, or stood by indifferently while they were enslaved, then I would be among the crowd that demands the removal of Christopher Columbus's statue. But it's just not in evidence. What is factual is there was this especially horrible guy called Roldan, Francisco Roldan. He was a Spaniard who revolted against Columbus and went on to start the encomienda system. That was a policy of land grants in which any indigenous who happened to be living on land became property. It was virtual slavery, and sadly, it spread all across Latin America. It's nowhere to be found that Columbus's goal was to conquer those people. He only wanted the islands as a trading post to finance a reconquista, which the title of the book indicates. He never intended to colonize the place, and it's on record that he ordered his men, the Spaniards, to treat the natives with dignity and honor. But sadly, Columbus couldn't govern all those men all the time, especially not while he's island hopping across the Caribbean. He can't be sailing from Trinidad to Venezuela to Honduras to Jamaica and also be policing the men back on Santo Domingo. It was physically impossible. But by his second voyage across the Atlantic, the islands became a truly dreadful place. This time there were 17 ships and 1,200 soldiers and sailors, many of them absolute scumbags. They tortured, enslaved, raped, and murdered many of the indigenous. However, in one instance, when Columbus busted a few Spaniards abusing the Indians, he had them executed for it, put to death completely. So yes, this is Columbus defending the Indians. They were his friends. He didn't want them harmed. Now, why those other authors, Zinn and Lowen, choose not to include any of this, I don't know. I can only surmise that they made a decision early on not to include anything flattering about Christopher Columbus in their writings. Something else that's often omitted about Columbus were his dealings with the Carib Indians. The Caribs, of which the Caribbean Sea is named after, were a ferocious tribe. They were torturers, slavers. There are multiple attestations of them practicing cannibalism. They would raid the Arawak and the Taino and capture them and sometimes castrate them. At one point, Columbus runs into these Carib Indians and they attack him. He and his crew fight them off and free their slaves and concubines. He even drops off the ex-slaves back on their home islands. It's just some straight up hero stuff right there. I'm going to say something controversial right now, so get ready to be mad at me. But I like Christopher Columbus. I think he's one of the good guys now. And Carol Delaney is a Christopher Columbus scholar. Those other authors, they're eating at the kids' table. Their writing just seems juvenile by comparison. This book is excellent. There's history, intrigue, politics, religious doctrine. How there's not a special on HBO about Christopher Columbus, I have no idea. Thanks for watching.